Hello, my name is Chris Barkin, and I want to welcome all of you to the William W. Hay Railroad Engineering Seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take care of a few of the usual housekeeping items. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off. You're not getting any audio. No?
Oh, I hear you tapping it.
Okay, thank you. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off or on to vibrate so we don't disturb the speaker. If we have a fire alarm, please exit from these doors, whichever seem most safe, and go just a few steps. At either end, there are stairs all the way down to the ground floor, and then you should exit the building. We'll gather on the north side of Main Street. Please use the buddy system, so make note of who's next to you, and please account for them when we get out there. We're not expecting any severe weather today, but if we were to have severe weather, again, we could exit from either this door or that door, but instead go behind this wall, down the hallway into the old part of Newmark. As soon as you get into the old part of Newmark, there's a set of stairs on the right, descend all the way to the basement. It's a very safe space in the event of severe weather. If you didn't swipe your ID card earlier, please be sure to sign the attendance sheet, including your name and affiliation. And if you did not receive a direct email announcement of this seminar, but would like to in the future, please legibly include your email address. I'll ask the speaker if we can't get a microphone to a questioner in the audience to repeat the question
Okay,
for the benefit
okay.
of the online audience. We'll try to get the microphone out there. All right. Well, the William W. Hay Railroad Seminar Series is sponsored by the Rail Transportation and Engineering Center here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And on behalf of all of us, we thank AAR, BNSF, CN, Hanson Professional Services, and the National University Rail Center of Excellence for their ongoing support of Railtech. It's greatly appreciated by those of us here on campus as well as those participating via the internet. I want to welcome the more than 125 people who registered for this seminar. They hail from 4 countries on 3 different continents, so once again we have an international audience. The list of attendees includes freight and passenger railroads, transit organizations, federal and state DOTs, engineering firms, universities, research organizations, technology developers and suppliers, and others. We're very pleased that all of you could join us today. Those of you who wish to receive PDHs for your participation today, please see the instructions with the information described in the email announcement for this seminar. So today's presentation is a bit of a change of pace. Most people have probably heard of Pullman sleeping cars, if not ridden one. If you watch old movies, when the characters traveled, one will often see them aboard these cars. Baseball teams used to travel from city to city overnight riding in the Pullman cars before we had West Coast teams, which necessitated flying, obviously. Less widely known is that Pullman was also a major manufacturer of freight cars and an innovative one, introducing welded car construction and many other improvements to freight car design and construction. Beyond the company's national impact, Pullman had a significant impact on the city of Chicago. And as you'll learn today, the Pullman neighborhood and factory grounds are of such significance that they were designated as a National Historical Park and a State Historic Site. We have a particularly notable speaker today to talk about this. Mr. Joseph Szabo is an Illinois native, having grown up in Riverdale, just outside Chicago. He's a 5th-generation railroader who started his own rail career in 1976 with the Illinois Central, where he worked as a yard switchman, road trainman, and commuter conductor. He served as the UTU's Illinois State Legislative Director from 1996 to 2009 and participated in state and federal rail safety rulemakings. I understand that included meeting with later to be President Barack Obama when he was serving in our state legislature. He also served for more than 20 years in municipal government in South suburban Riverdale, Illinois, beginning his public service as a zoning commissioner, park district commissioner, village trustee, and ultimately mayor. In 2009, Mr. Szabo was tapped for federal service when he was nominated and confirmed as the 12th FRA administrator under President Obama. After he left the FRA in 2015, he was named Executive Director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, the 7-county region's official comprehensive planning organization, where he retired from in 2019. But not being one to sit still, Mr. Szabo continued his passion for public service by serving as President Emeritus of the Historic Pullman Foundation, the official nonprofit partner of the Pullman National Historical Park in Chicago. Mr. Szabo earned his BA in Business Administration from Governor State University and received an honorary doctorate from Lewis University for his lifetime commitment to public service. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph Szabo, who will present today's Hay seminar entitled Pullman and the Story of America.
Well, thank you, Chris, and it's great to be here at the University of Illinois, down here in Champaign. You know, I was reflecting on my drive here. Chris talks about, that I'm a fifth-generation railroader, started my railroad career in 1976, and while I mostly worked commuter service and yard service as a switchman, I did work over the road a little bit, and my very first road trip was on Good Friday, 1977. I would have been 19 years old, and it was from Homewood, Illinois, right here to Champaign. So Champaign holds a special place for me as a part of my railroad career. As Chris said, the talk today is probably a little bit different from what you're used to in an engineering series, but I do consider it an important part of history, and that's why it should be relevant to you, not just as engineers that are studying in the railroad field, but really these are the stories of America. At the Historic Pullman Foundation, our tagline is, America's stories live in Pullman. And there's two reasons we say that. One, to emphasize the fact that it is still, even though it's a national park, it is still a living, breathing community today, full of incredible residents that are so passionate about the history that they get to talk about. Many of them are fifth generations themselves, are descendants of folks that began working for the Pullman Company back in the 1800s. And so they're passionate about telling these stories. But I think as you'll find out about the first part of my talk, these stories of America are relevant to every single one of us today. So we're going to do this a little bit backwards. Instead of, having the lecture and then a quiz, we're going to open up right away with a quiz. And so I have a question to the group. Those of you online, you can't respond, but you can think about it. How many in this room own an automobile? Raise your hand. Yeah, most of the room. Or at least you've been in an automobile, right? Your parents own an automobile. Your friends own an automobile. So I'm sure you're aware of Henry Ford's assembly line, Ford's use of interchangeable parts, and how it revolutionized manufacturing. I mean, the assembly line is still used today. All right, hold that thought. How many of you, question number 2, have been in downtown Chicago, in Grant Park, and admired Chicago's lakefront? Raise your hand. Yeah, again, most of the room. Okay, hold that thought. How many of you have enjoyed a backyard barbecue or other family gathering on Labor Day? Yep, raise a hand. Okay, all right, hold that thought.
These aren't very hard questions.
Well, I know, but I'm getting you thinking. It wasn't meant to be a hard quiz. The key question is coming up. So the fourth one. How many of you are either aware of the civil rights movement, a product of the civil rights movement, children of those that were a part of the civil rights movement, or certainly aware of the civil rights movement and its impact on America? Yeah, okay, most of the room. All right, so my question then is, what do Henry Ford's assembly line, Chicago's lakefront, Labor Day, and the civil rights movement all have in common? All of them have a legacy connection to Pullman. I will argue that no square mile of land anywhere else in the nation has had a more transformative impact on America. And that's why we say America's stories live in Pullman. And that's why in February 2015, President Obama declared the Pullman neighborhood and factory site as Pullman National Monument at that time, a part of the National Park Service, and why in 2022 Congress and President Biden, by legislative action, elevated it to full national park status. But to really understand it, you have to back up. So let's go back 175 years and talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. It changed America. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, economies were small, they were regional. In essence, they were no bigger than the distance a horse could walk in a day. Think about that. People spent their lives locally, very little mobility. Information traveled very slowly. Goods were either produced at home or from local craftsmen. So the Transcontinental Railroad actually was the internet of its time. I mean, think about it. It was that important. What the internet does today, the Transcontinental Railroad did for our nation at that time. It tied together this vast continent. It made our national resources widely available, accelerated the speed of communication, allowed people to be more mobile, and opened up westward migration. It created our national economy. And so this would have been the world that a 28-year-old George Pullman would have experienced as he migrated from upstate New York to Chicago in 1859. And while rail travel at that time was incredibly revolutionary compared to a stagecoach or walking on foot or riding on horseback, it still remained very uncomfortable. You were sitting on wooden benches, there were no amenities, and you were on those benches perhaps sometimes for a couple of days. And so while George Pullman was not the first to design a sleeping car, he was the one that really had the vision, set the bar for excellence in service, quality, and comfort. He's the one that perfected it. And his details were meticulous. It was marketed as luxury for the middle class. And former slaves, as you can see here, were hired to provide this luxury service. And the jobs as Pullman porters were, very demanding, often demeaning, initially unpaid. They survived on tips only. But the porters were viewed with great esteem in their local communities because they were able to travel the nation and make incomes beyond what most former slaves could earn. And so while they suffered many indignities while providing this Pullman standard of service, they were able to do it in a dignified manner. I'll come back to the porters. But this was all a part of how Pullman began to dominate the sleeping car market, and he quickly began buying up competitors. And as orders grew for his Pullman Palace sleeping cars, it was time for a new and modern factory, one that Pullman could design from the ground up to meet these high standards of excellence and innovation that he had. And so in 1880, he purchased 4,000 acres. Think about that, it's a lot of land. 4,000 acres, 14 miles south of the city of Chicago, but it was conveniently located on the Illinois Central Railroad. And the size of this land was critical to Pullman's vision for vertical integration in both the manufacturing and the operation of his railcar fleet. I mean, this guy wanted to control every single aspect, from the construction on up to the service that was performed on board the cars. And I argue that no entrepreneur or industry in that time used both vertical and horizontal integration to the magnitude that Pullman did. It not only helped him eliminate competition, or minimize competition, I should say, but it ensured his obsession for quality, control, attention to detail in every single aspect of the operation. The Pullman Company imported their own raw materials, they rolled their own steel, they cast their own iron and cast their own brass, they manufactured their own paint, they printed their own forms and tickets. More than 80%, think about this, more than 80% of the components in Pullman's rail cars were made from raw materials that turned into finished product. And he was one of the leaders in using standardized designs and perfected the standardization of interchangeable parts. And he constructed a transfer table that allowed rail cars to be moved from one workstation to the next workstation as they progressed through that construction process. And this is what led Henry Ford to visit Pullman, as Ford was contemplating his vision for interchangeable parts in the assembly line, which ultimately revolutionized manufacturing. And so while Ford was the one that perfected it, a significant part of the genesis does come from Pullman. So Pullman's obsession with vertical integration even extended to the community that he had built adjacent to the factory site. He hired architect Solomon Beeman to design the nation's first plan model industrial community, and architect Nathan Barrett to design the street layout and park system. And he did this to make sure that he could attract the highest caliber of craftsmen that were migrating in from Europe. He wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to live in a community that was clean, orderly, and free of what Pullman called the baneful elements that negatively impacted most working class communities of that time. The town included more than 1,300 houses, one for everyone from executives to supervisors to the high-skilled craftsmen to the low-skilled workers, and all had indoor plumbing, which was incredibly unheard of at that time. In fact, talking about Pullman's vertical integration and using everything, even the sewage was used. It ran a couple miles down towards the Little Calumet River, where it was collected and used as fertilizer in the farms that ultimately made the produce that was sold at Market Hall in the community. So I say that's about as complete on vertical integration as you can get. And even the bricks in these homes, of course, they were made by the Pullman Company from clay from a local clay hole. The homes remained owned and controlled by the Pullman Company, and employees were expected to pay rent. And in addition to Barrett's well-designed parks, amenities included a theater, the iconic Greenstone Church, which you can see in black and white here, but it's a striking image, Market Hall, school building. I mean, the town was just beautiful. And the centerpiece was the palatial Hotel Florence, named after Pullman's favorite daughter. All of them designed to create this impressive presentation to visitors as they arrived at the Illinois Central train station. And it remains just as striking a visual today when you arrive there on the Metro Electric at 111th. I mean, the entire community there is presented in front of you. The community in this orderly design, as it was called, became known as Pullman's perfect town. And it became a beacon for architects and urban planners from across the globe, across the world. Remains highly regarded in architecture and urban planning circles today. Was considered a must-see stop for visitors to the 1892 World's Fair. Again, they came from around the world to see Pullman's perfect town, most of them arriving on the Illinois Central, getting that grand presentation as they stepped off the train. But one architect and urban planner who took notice was Daniel Burnham, who later became the author of the renowned Plan for Chicago. Burnham is famous for the words, "Make no small plans." And his plan for Chicago is the one that ultimately was instrumental in the formation, the protection of Chicago's famed lakefront and parks network. I mean, you go to almost any other community, you've got industry, you've got steel mills, that are crowding the pristine view of the lake. Burnham and his vision is what gave us the gift of Chicago's lakefront. So Burnham learned from Pullman, and the shared belief that they had of good order was an essential element for healthy communities. And so the lakefront's a great example of this good order. So a year later, 1893, Depression hits, and order for Pullman cars significantly decline. Layoffs begin at the factory. Wages are reduced for those that are still employed, but the rents on the homes remain the same. And this squeeze left the workers in a rather untenable position. In addition, the good order that Pullman visioned for his community included real tight controls over residents and how they could act in the neighborhood, what they could do on their front porches. And there was no self-determination for the residents, no elements of democracy. And so a real festering was going on underneath the surface. And with the economic downturn, this led to the strike of 1894, which is considered by many historians to be our nation's most historic strike. Factory workers had just joined the American Railway Union, led by labor union leader Eugene V. Debs. And when Pullman refused to entertain any of the workers' demands or even arbitrate, a national boycott of Pullman railcars ensued. So no train that was carrying a Pullman car would be moved. And so what started as a strike of some 4,000 local factory workers grew to more than 125,000 railroad workers on 29 railroads throughout the country that walked off the job rather than handle Pullman cars. And this was the first time in our nation that a local strike action ever evolved into a national shutdown. So the General Managers Association was the one responsible for coordinating the response for the rail industry on the strike, and they began the practice of ensuring that they attached a mail car to every train that was carrying a Pullman car. Richard Olney was the Attorney General for the United States of America at that time under President Grover Cleveland. Olney was a railroad attorney and actually remained on the payroll of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy while also serving as Attorney General. It wasn't viewed as a conflict of interest in those days. And a little factoid, his salary as Attorney General for the nation was $8,000 a year. He was earning $10,000 a year on retainer from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Don't know how much, if any, that impacted his decision making, but it's an important fact. So a national crisis ensued because of the mail being interrupted. And commerce and mail across much of the nation came to a standstill. Again, using the internet analogy, think of the internet being turned off today, right? And this going on for 2 months. Impact was immense. Federal troops were brought in. Olney secured a federal injunction against Debs and the American Railway Union. Debs was ultimately charged with conspiracy. The strike was broken, and the ARU was disbanded. Famed attorney Clarence Darrow actually was brought in to defend Debs, and while the charges against him were reduced, he did ultimately spend 6 months in jail. And so while the strike was crushed, and at the time it was considered, a loss for the workers, it did ultimately impact labor law and industrial labor policy because nobody wanted a repeat. And so it impacts labor law even up to today. More important, at least for the purpose of my presentation, in an effort to conciliate organized labor, 6 days after the strike ended, President Grover Cleveland and Congress designated Labor Day as a federal holiday. So you can check that box now. We've hit 3 of the 4. In 1898, the Supreme Court ordered Pullman Company to divest itself of the residential properties, and at that time Pullman became a regular Chicago neighborhood. As I said, a thriving community today. Folks down there are incredibly proud to be a part of the national park. So earlier I was talking about the Pullman porters and their dignity in providing this first-class service, but there's quite a bit more to the Pullman's porters' stories and their deep, enduring impact on America. Formed by charismatic leader A. Philip Randolph in 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became the first African-American labor union recognized by the AFL-CIO. That in itself was a big achievement. Union won its first contract with the Pullman Company. It took 12 years, not until 1937, but that was the first contract by a black labor union. So again, big achievement. But more important, Randolph used the union and his position in the AFL-CIO to break down racial segregation in the American labor movement. And of course, it was pervasive at that time. And he used his position as a springboard for the civil rights movement. Not only were the Porters the true fathers, I'll say, of the civil rights movement, but they also were key in fostering the Great Migration. Porters would sneak bundles of the Chicago Defender newspaper onto their trains, and of course the National Rail Network all hubs out of Chicago, still does today. And they would take the Chicago Defender across the nation, dropping them off at points along the way, all at the risk of being fired if they got caught, but they were spreading news on civil rights and opportunities up north. And so this fostered the civil rights movement. It fostered the Great Migration to a point where Julian Bond, longtime civil rights leader and former chair of the NAACP, called the Porters the envy of the community. And Larry Tye, who authored a book called Rising from the Rails, makes what I view as a real compelling argument that the Porters served not only as the foundation of the civil rights movement, the Great Migration, but also of the rise of black middle and upper class. He points out that the Porters' most lasting legacy was actually through their children and grandchildren and all that they ultimately ended up achieving economically, socially, and politically. And it's a long list of distinguished descendants, from Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall to Tom Bradley, who was the first black mayor of Los Angeles, Willie Brown, who was the first black mayor of San Francisco. But this list goes on in the medical profession, in business and industry, and into corporate boardrooms. It's an incredible, enduring legacy. So you can learn more about these, what I call 4 themes, 4 pillar stories of Pullman at the Pullman National Historical Park. I could go on and on talking about how Pullman has impacted presidential politics, presidential policies, or influenced American culture. I'll give you one tidbit, including the film The Polar Express. You know, if you watch Polar Express, look at the North Pole. That's Pullman. And yeah, it is. It is. And the creator of the film actually was from the area and well aware of it. But its place in culture is deep too. But I want to pivot to the project now that I've been asked to lead in bringing historic rail cars back to the factory site. So it's an important point that the factory today, while it's got a visitor center that does a wonderful job on these 4 themes of Pullman, there's no rail cars there. And so the park superintendent asked me to take on an effort to get select pieces of historic equipment brought back into the factory site. And this historic structure map gives you a little bit of context. Let's see if I got the... All right, I can't get the pointer to work, but as you can see here on the far right, running from top to bottom, north to south, that was the original Pullman Railroad. Single track exists today. It is now the Pullman branch of the Norfolk Southern. But the series of tracks that run across the bottom, east to west, were long removed years ago, and so there is no turnout, no spur siding into the factory site today. And so in working with Norfolk Southern, we've not only got a commitment to put a turnout and spur back into the factory site, but they've agreed to actually build us the turnout and fund its maintenance into perpetuity and give us up to 4 free switching moves in and out of the factory site each year. We consider this important. We want to make sure that the site can be connected to the National Rail Network. It's not intended to be a railroad museum. It is intended to have a small handful of select rail cars there that fit with the interpretive themes that the National Park Service has identified. But we do want the ability to be able to bring other pieces of equipment in and out, change out exhibits, for special events like Railroad Days, had the ability to bring different equipment in to display. And so that connection is important. Much of this factory site is gone today, has been destroyed by fire or replaced over the years. But what does exist, up at the top you can see the remaining ruins of the rear erecting shop. And the long-term goal is to restore the rear erecting shops. There would be 10 tracks inside the rear erecting shops. But we're looking for a way to get displays in place sooner rather than later. Again, that was one of the priorities the Park Service gave us. And so it begins with rebuilding the 5-track yard that runs east to west there along 111th Street, which would be at the bottom of this picture, adjacent to the rear erecting shops. And you can see a driveway there running top to bottom, north to south on the right. We'll ultimately be looking to build a modern transfer table that would serve as the access from the single-track spur coming in off of Norfolk Southern, would access each of the 5 tracks in the yard, the new display yard. And then ultimately, as the rear erecting shops are done and those 10 tracks go in, we would be able to use it to access the rear erecting shop. So that'll be in a later phase. The phase 1 that we're looking at funding now would just be the 5-track yard. And then in the center there, a display building. And that is not authentic. This is the location where Pullman would park new cars when they were completed, when they came out of the factory. He would put them there to be on display. If you kept going down on the bottom, past 111th Street, just on the other side would be the Hotel Florence, where the guests would stay. And so he wanted, again, it was all about the presentation. He was a marketer well beyond his time, presenting these cars to those visitors. And so our 5-track yard goes back in where the 5-track yard was, allows us to park cars and display them where he would have parked his cars. But the display building, as you can see here, and I've got some other pictures, is all glass. And so while it will provide us the ability to protect these artifacts from the weather, keep them in a climate-controlled environment, keep them safe from any vandalism, by being glass on 3 sides, other than the east side here, where the doors are, that would be closed off, but everything else would be glass. Here you get a better view. Would allow us to park 2 cars inside the glass building on tracks 1 and track number 3. In the center, you can see a little bit here, and I've got another diagram be a little bit better. Over track number 2 in the center will actually be a wooden platform. So while the track will go back where it was originally, it won't be utilized. We'll have the platform on top of track number 2, and that will allow the ability to view the rail cars on track 1 and track 3. You can see a little bit here on the far right, some of the homes in the Hotel Florence that is there. Be kind of a pavilion area there where folks can gather. This design was taken from old historic train stations of that era. Architect that did the work pro bono for us took a look at several of the stations from that era, and that's why the overhangs were put in. But as you can see on the far left, track number 4 will actually be out of doors but under cover. One of the cars that we have a letter of first refusal in on is Superliner that's still in use by Amtrak today. That is the final car ever built at the Pullman factory, aptly named the George M. Pullman. And so we have a letter of first refusal in to get that if and when the day comes that Amtrak takes it out of service. And you would not be able, because that's a low-level boarding, double-decker, wouldn't be able to view that properly from the platform. And so in this design, even though it'll be out of doors, we would be able to park it on track number 4 underneath the overhang, and you could access it then from the ground. And so some forethought has been put into when the day comes that we get the George M. Pullman. This would be the view actually from the Hotel Florence. from across 111th Street. And again, that car would be sitting right where the cars would have been displayed, 100 years ago, in incredibly visible. This would be actually from the visitor center's back doors, looking towards the southeast. And here's the schematic. As you can see, there would be a ramp, so it would be ADA accessible. I've got some questions whether this ends up our final design because of the location of the restroom facilities, but we did want those in there. We do envision the opportunity to host some special events in the building, with the cars there on display, so we wanted full plumbing in. But all of this has been put together to serve a collection of cars, and what we've done, we actually spent time talking with the interpretive staff at the National Park Service and also at the State Department of Natural Resources. They have historical preservation because this site is actually both. It's a state historic site as well as a national park. And kind of went through their interpretive visions for the rail cars and then put together a plan that identified those cars, at least that we were aware of. It's not end-all complete, but those that are aware of in various states of disrepair around the country that align, with those interpretive themes that the Park Service the stories are looking to tell. And from there, we will prioritize the very small handful of cars that we will select in priority order and restore. We've got two that we're focusing on right now. The first one is actually a car that the state of Illinois owns today called the Advance. It was built, I believe it was in 1911. Didn't put it in my notes today. But the state already owns it, and what's significant about it was actually used by Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, when Robert Todd was the president and then later chairman of the Pullman Company. And so we got a great Lincoln connection with Robert Todd's use of the Advance when he was with the Pullman Company. In fact, we've got a letter that he wrote in 1924. The car had just come out of a refresh at the Pullman Car Works, and Lincoln was the first to use the car after it was refreshed. And we found a letter at the Newberry Library that he wrote just praising the refresh they had done on it. And we believe that was the last trip he ever took. He died just a couple of weeks later. We still need to verify that, but we believe the last trip of his life was taken in the Advance. The car was also used by President Woodrow Wilson in 1914 and 1915. Calvin Coolidge used it twice in 1924. And so the restoration of this car is our highest priority. We plan for that to be the first car that we roll into the display building when it's done. We've got a grant in right now, not yet been awarded, but got a grant in to complete the external restoration on it, as well as the mechanical components that are necessary to make it roadworthy. Again, we've made the decision that every piece of equipment that we restore, we do want to make sure it can function on the general railroad network, not Amtrak standards. We're not looking for it to haul passengers, but we do want it to be able to roll on the national rail network. Got a partnership going on with a railroad nonprofit up in Silvis, Illinois, that does some incredible restoration work, and so the plans are for it to be restored there. More importantly, as we begin collecting cars, we look to store our cars in Silvis until such time as we have the funding that we need to one by one restore them. And that becomes another important part of being on the national rail network. Being able to roll the cars in from Silvis to the Pullman factory site. Another exciting development, just got offered this incredible wooden Pullman car that was built in 1899 and delivered to the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific in January of 1900. Car is privately owned. It's up in Black River Falls, Wisconsin right now. For being 125 years old, the shell on it and the underframe is in fantastic shape. It was originally a parlor car for the Chicago Rock Island. On the lower right there you can see, this is an actual photo of the interior that was taken when it was built. This was for luxury travel. Instead of sitting in coach service, you were sitting in basically what I would call a living room chair. You can't see it on here, but actually next to the windows on the wooden beams there's call buttons for the porters. So porters actually did provide service to the passengers in these parlor cars. We like that because that allows us to, tell those Pullman porter stories. Car was converted actually to like a dining car and was used at the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1949. And that was actually one of the reasons why the Rock Island maintained the car and kept it in such good shape. It went into private ownership in the 1960s, but this is car 699. Car 698, which was built at the same time, is long gone. It was, destroyed probably about 70 years ago. But because the Rock Island used this one at the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1949, it's why it's so well maintained. And so being offered this gift was just incredible. We've come up with at the Newberry Library again, the original plans for this. So we've got all the original blueprints, photos, and so we know what we need to restore towards. Ironically, my extended family, owns 6 of these chairs. Yeah, believe it or not. Now I don't know that it was 6 in this photo. Let me caution that. But my grandpa's brother, my great uncle John, was a carpenter for the Rock Island. And about 1950, when they were scrapping all the parlor cars, Uncle John made available to various members of the family for $5 these chairs. $10 if you wanted him to put legs on them. So my mom and dad had 2. One set of aunt and uncle had 2. My other aunt and uncle had 2. And I actually had my parents' 2 for the longest time. I gave them to my niece a few years ago. But I've talked to my cousins, I've talked to my niece. All of them are willing to donate the 6 chairs back to the cause. And the story gets even better. My younger brother, actually has Uncle John's, well, he doesn't have the toolbox anymore. That broke apart. But all the tools that Uncle John used when he was a carpenter on the Rock Island 100 years ago. And he said, yeah, he'll gladly donate those. So the plan on this car, actually, this one will not go in the glass house. This was built in the North Factory Wing, and that's not open to the public. We've got some environmental remediation that needs to be done. But the first bay, right off of the National Park Service Visitor Center, is where this car would have been built in 1899. We're working with the state. We've got to come up with the funding to do the environmental remediation. I only want to move the car once, and so the owner is willing to be patient with us. He'll give me up to 2 years. We're going to have to lift it by crane and truck it, and at 125 years old, I don't want to lift it more than once on each end. So the plan is to stick it in the north wing in that first bay that is right there off the visitor center where it was built. And the plans would be for it to be, the restoration to be a living exhibit. And so the public will get to watch it be restored. My hopes are that Uncle John's tools are used as a part of that, since it's probable those tools worked on this car, this very car, at some point or another. The chairs, I think, are a stretch, maybe, who knows. But the tools, there's little doubt. His tools worked on this car. And anyway, this gift was a little bit of a curveball for me, because our entire vision had been on the spur track, working with NS, getting the glass display building built, put together our tentative budget on that. We've got a verbal agreement. We're working on the final MOU with the state of Illinois, the National Park Service, and my organization. We're looking to do a 3-way split on the funding of it. About an $18 million project there, so looking for 6, 6, and 6 $6 million from the Park Service, $6 million from the state of Illinois, and then I have to philanthropically raise $6 million. But that didn't include the wood car or the North Bay, and so we've just grown it to 21 million. You know, so it's just 777 now. Again, slightly off of our initial focus, but too exciting of an opportunity to pass up. So that is my talk on both why Pullman is important, is historically significant on our effort to bring the rail cars back in. And with that, I open it up for any questions. Any way you want to go with questions, I'll take them.
I'll just make an observation. I don't know if you saw the article, I think it was in the New York Times just within the last few days, about how the famous African-American musicians traveling around, especially in the southern part of the United States, suffered prejudice and problems and even danger, obviously. So the Pullman cars with their African-American porters were a refuge for them, and they preferred to stay in them when they were traveling rather than going out and staying in hotels. And there was a real camaraderie developed between various, very famous musicians and the Pullman porter community. And this is also reflected in a number of these songs which are written about railroad travel and that sort of thing. It was a really interesting article. If you haven't seen it, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, do. It's not in my, realm of expertise, but I do know that they say, that the porters, again, had an influential role. I think you're kind of alluding to it in the development of jazz. And again, also the migration of jazz up from New Orleans to Chicago. That's why I say, I picked the four big themes, the impact on manufacturing and the assembly line, the impact on Chicago's lakefront, the impact on Labor Day and labor history, and then the impact of the porters. But these stories can go in so many different directions. And I would offer that no matter who you are, you can find a connection to a part of your life story through the stories of Pullman, because it is such a rich story of immigration, of the Great Migration. For me personally, I first discovered Pullman when I was, a new hire commuter train conductor in 1976. And Riverdale was just a little bit south of Pullman, but I was completely unaware of it. And I started working these trains, and I'm passing through Pullman, a couple of times a day. And it's like, wow, what is this? What is this community? Because again, it's still striking. You go there today, you feel like you're transformed back to the 1880s. And then when I learned its place in not just railroading history, but in labor history, and I, did my time as a labor representative, proud labor representative, and then my time in local government, starting in zoning and community planning and ultimately leading a planning agency before I retired, all these stories ended up resonating with me in my career. But again, I would offer no matter who you are, if you start understanding your life story, you're going to find a connection to Pullman. In the back.
Okay. So I was just thinking about some of the cars we see in Europe are also based on Pullman's design. Is that right? Because I think the Orient Express, the cars of the of the early 20th century were all based on that design, on the same design.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Because
So I cannot say definitively, but it wouldn't surprise me. Again, because Pullman completely revolutionized car design, in the United States, and because the community and factory site was such a magnet for international visitors, that wouldn't surprise me in the least. Chris, and you talked about it in the opening, I didn't touch on it here, but yeah, Pullman's role in freight car manufacturing, the manufacturing they did during the wars, the world wars, where they I'd have to talk to one of our archivists. Again, not really strong in my area of expertise, but they did a lot of manufacturing for the war effort, and so the passenger cars, the sleeper cars, the diner cars, the Pullman porters get a lot of the attention in the stories, but it's bigger than that.
Any other questions here?
Enjoy your presentation, wonderful. The Pullman cars that were out in the fleet, now did Pullman own them or did the railroads own them with Pullman crews?
Yeah.
Or a mix of both?
A little bit of a mix, but the majority he owned and leased to again, part of this vertical integration, man, he wanted to control everything, including the onboard service. And so in most cases, particularly in the earlier years, he owned them. He staffed them. Obviously, from a railroad operations, it was the host railroad's crews that ran the train. But when it came to the service on board those cars, that was all Pullman.
So the card you showed that was delivered to the Rock Island.
Yeah.
That was still Pullman owned that car, but it just stayed within the Rock Island network?
I'm unsure. Need to go back and check that, and I know we'll be able to get that through the Newberry. I've got a railcar expert who's just incredible. I could tell you that story, how I met him down in Sarasota, Florida, but he's become a vital part of this and does all the research at the Newberry, the Smithsonian, and elsewhere. The contract clearly shows it being built for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. And that's why I pause a little bit, that I am unsure whether they actually owned it or not. When the contract shows it being built for the Rock Island, it leads you to believe that it was owned by them. And perhaps because it was a parlor car, not a sleeper, though it was staffed by porters, this may have been an actual Rock Island car. So, to be determined. But the predecessor, the Advance, now this clearly was a Pullman-owned, operated and controlled car, and in fact this one was part of their fleet that they would in essence job out, and so the company never sent this one off to an individual railroad to be operated. It was kept in control of the company, used by their executives, by US presidents and others that may have the need to use it. So this was a business car. We think that's an important part of what needs to be presented, because it shows what the luxury travel was like for chief executives back in that day. I probably get offered a business car about once a month, and if we have one, we have one. That's all we're going to need. So we're going to need a sleeper. You talk about the baseball players and that. Clearly we need a sleeper of that era, before the roomettes were built that had the curtains on that, the convertibles. We've got a couple that we've got a line on. So I call it Some Like It Hot. For those, some of you younger ones may not know the film. It's a great movie. Great movie. But the Some Like It Hot car. Got an offer on what was the first generation car that CSX is holding down in Jacksonville. They don't own it, but it's in their yard. The Glen Air, used on the Chicago Northwestern, is kind of the first rendition of those that was built with rooms. And so that will be a part of the mix. We just signed a letter of intent to, we haven't signed it yet, but the letter's been drawn up, for a car called the General Jackson, which ran on the Illinois Central. So it would have run through Champaign here every day, basically, on the Panama Limited. That was a more luxury sleeper with an incredible lounge and a U-shaped bar on it. And so that one we've got an offer for free donation on. But my point is, we're trying to make sure that we get the right mix. We've got to find a dining car. A couple of options there, none of them good, none of them hot at the moment. But again, how do we find the right mix of cars? Definitely need a freight car there, Chris, at least one in the mix. Trying to make sure that we tell as many of the stories as we can.
I have a couple final questions. Did the Pullman cars run all the way up until the Amtrak era?
So they would not have been Pullman owned anymore by that point, at least to my knowledge. I think most of them were not. They, by that point, were owned by the host railroad. You know, I certainly remember seeing porters on the Green Diamond when I would ride that, you know, in the 60s. And there was no sleeper car service, but you know, the guy, he had the porter on his hat. You know, that was just a Chicago-St. Louis train. But, you know, by that point, the Pullman company was, you know, getting out of the business. They were just manufacturing. And again, that order of superliners finished up in 1981. And the George M. Pullman Superliner Sleeper was the final car built. So.
And finally, what's the status of your building? You have a timeline, and how's your funding going for it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have a timeline, and then my federal and state bureaucracies have a slightly different timeline. You know, the feelings are that once the MOU is signed and we begin fundraising in earnest, I would like to see, you know, the building up and the advance rolled in there within a 2-year time frame. It's aggressive. You know, I keep cracking the whip on this, and but again, get pulled back into some realities of dealing with a state and federal bureaucracy. We've lined up about $7 million in potential grant funding. So again, none of those have been awarded yet, but we've got a line on about 7. So on about 1/3 of what I need. I got a wonderful donor who just wrote me a $100,000 check, which will allow my organization to set up the internal infrastructure that we need to run a bona fide philanthropic fundraising effort. And we've got a retired fundraising consultant who's been helping us pro bono. That's going to come to an end, but we have a much clearer understanding of how that process will need to flow. Starting with the feasibility study that will help us identify what is the full realm of what the project likely could raise, what's our network of potential funders. Right now, those are all scribbled on little notes on my desk, but they'll go into a formal database. We've acquired that database so we can start our data management. And yeah, so we think we're about 1/3 of the way there. Long ways to go, a lot of money.
We've got a number of questions from our online audience, but I'll also partially answer the question that was asked. I don't understand the details, but sometimes either in the late 40s or early 50s, Pullman was required to divest of its Pullman
fleet.
cars.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so quite a bit later after the community, but still, you know,
Right.
forced the breakup. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so first question is, will the display facility be tall enough to display taller cars such as the Superliner?
So, yeah, that drawing, let's go the other way. Drawing is a little bit of a misnomer, but the answer is yes. While this drawing here doesn't look like on the far left it would hold a Superliner, the measurements, you know, have been designed with that in mind. So, yeah, drawing's a little bit off, but Superliner definitely will fit on track number 4.
Great. Another question, with the CTA Red Line extension coming to the Pullman neighborhood, is your foundation involved in any collaboration efforts with them? Also, how do you think the extension will affect the monument and its surrounding neighborhood?
Yeah. So, yeah, we have been a part of the, what I'll call community input that CTA, you know, continues to gather on the project. You know, obviously our primary way of reaching the facility is still Metro Electric. You know, that's where you get the grand, you know, visual of the Pullman site, just like, again, visitors would have in the 1880s. But without a doubt, the Red Line, you know, extending further south, getting into the adjacent Roseland community is going to be a plus. And anything that makes it easier for folks to get there, you know, is a good thing. So Metro Electric's great, but CTA would certainly have much more frequent service. And we view it important, you know, while our work is entirely about supporting the National Park Service, we view the ultimate effect of that, of having a strong economic input on not just the Pullman neighborhood, but on the broader neighborhood. So getting into Roseland and Burnham and helping provide greater economic growth for those adjacent communities is an important part of our work, but it's secondary in nature.
Okay, the next question actually comes from a mutual friend of ours, Joe. How can we help achieve these goals of restoration?
Yeah, so biggest thing right now is going to be raising money, right? And I didn't come here to squeeze people. You know, obviously this is a university setting, so I'm not asking you to bring your checkbooks and write checks. But you know, first and foremost is going to be securing the funding. We've not formalized this yet, but we do envision, you know, putting a volunteer team together that will help do the maintenance, you know, man the displays, and you know, be both not only in protecting the equipment, but it being the public face to the equipment. So, yeah, on the restoration itself, initially it's going to be about money.
Next question. Could Administrator Szabo please comment on the challenges of securing stable funding that ensures cars and exhibits can be preserved pending restoration, despite vagaries of government funding, which may be affected by the state of the economy, the mood of Congress, and the General Assembly?
So our MOU will address that, right? And that's an important part of this three-way split in identifying what are the roles that the federal government can appropriately take on, can securely fund. Same thing with the state of Illinois, and then what is my, you know, organization going to be responsible for doing philanthropically. And so it is a matter of understanding, you know, who can do what best. And I do envision that while we've got a line potentially on a $3 million grant to restore the Advance, I actually believe that fundraising on the Advance and the Rock Island car are going to be part of the easier work. Funding the infrastructure is going to be tougher. I've got a Zoom meeting with some other folks in a couple of weeks with the US EPA. You know, we'll be looking at what kind of environmental cleanup funding might be available. It's a real expensive part of the project. You know, all this land where we've got to build the track and that was originally part of the Pullman factory site. We know what levels of contamination they needed to deal with when they built the visitor center in the original clock tower building, and so that'll be a big part of it. So, you know, we're just going to have to look at grants. And then ultimately, we will have a business model that will help us provide the ongoing annual costs. So between Park Service funding and then as the philanthropic partner, you know, our work in the volunteer world, you know, we'll make sure that we've got a plan to make sure that they're properly maintained.
Okay, thank you. I still have more questions, and I think we've got a little time, so.
We'll go as long as
it's okay with you. You partially answered this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. What is the long-term plan for how many rail cars will be brought to the site, and will this include Pullman-built freight cars and rapid transit cars?
Yeah. So it could. I mean, rapid transit is an important part of the story, right? And I have to admit, our working group has not talked about that much, but the CTA in Chicago has an incredible legacy, you know, of Pullman-built equipment. But freight cars, definitely. You know, I would say, I go back to the scope that we signed with the Park Service in the state of Illinois when we started this on. And originally they were telling us to, you know, come up with a feasible, timely, and cost-effective strategy to bring up to 3 to 5 cars with appropriate interpretive value. That was before this budding relationship with the nonprofit in Silvis emerged. And over the next decade, I mean, we're going to have to take this step by step, right? I need to get some infrastructure built first, need to get the first 2 cars, which we've identified as priorities, done. But I could see us having up to, say, 7. The site will not hold that, but with Silvis, you know, I do envision where we could store some of our fleet out there and say once a year when we do railroad days, we bring the entire fleet in for the weekend, right? have everything available for public viewing over the course of that weekend. You kind of switch out your display and take what you're not utilizing back to Silvis for storage. The display case would effectively display 3 cars. The wood car will go in the north wing. And so on site, you know, on a semi-permanent basis, I would not envision us having more than 4 cars other than for special occasions. So the fleet could grow up to 7.
Will other early passenger car manufacturers that the Pullman Company bought out as they became the dominant company be represented at the museum? Wagner comes to mind.
Yeah, not really been discussed. You know, again, much of this is being driven by the interpretive themes that the Park Service has identified. It's funny, my working group is real enthusiastic and, you know, and rail buffs and folks that have done a lot of restoration work. May own private cars, and I've had to make clear to them over and over again, this isn't our vision, you know, that we're the ones that are the tools to implement the Park Service's vision. Likely, I would say, because of the factory site there, not that they would necessarily have to have been built at that factory, but I think there's going to be, you know, a heavy bias towards those that were actually built by the Pullman Company when it was the Pullman Company, or one of the renditions of the Pullman Company.
Okay. We're going to have to probably wrap this up because we are getting at the bottom of the hour here, but can you comment on any currently operating private cars that have visited the property?
I mean, the only thing I can say is it's been wonderful every year for Railroad Days through the APRCO, American Association of Private Railcar Owners. They're wonderful. And these private owners, every year they come up with at least 3 cars that, you know, they bring to Chicago, and between Amtrak and Siena Metra, we get them down to Pullman. Park them at the 111th Street station, and they become wonderful, wonderful displays for the public. It's probably the biggest draw for Pullman Railroad Days. A lot more is going on. Mark your calendars. May 17th and 18th, I think, Saturday and Sunday will be Pullman Railroad Days this year. But that was originally, you know, my vision. Because the factory site doesn't have cars, we have to bring the cars to us. And the private rail car owners have just been wonderful. You know, you see some beautiful work that has been done. So they've been great to work with, and it gives us an opportunity to get some authentic equipment down there.
Here's another suggestion for a car. The Club Car from the 20th Century Limited, one of America's most iconic trains, is sitting somewhere in Buffalo. Perhaps you could look into acquiring that.
I'll have to see if it's in our in the plan that Dave has put together for us. I know there's about 25 I identified, but again, it's not all complete. So yeah, no, I'll take that one down.
And last question, and this one might be a more complicated answer. Do you think the full vertical integration resulted in the failure of the company?
It's a good question. You know, I mean, I think I would take it in a slightly different direction. In the Park Service's Visitor Center, you know, they're good on posing questions rather than stating an opinion. So, like, for example, his control in the community, you know, I don't know exactly how they say it, but, you know, paternalistic or control freak, right? You know, and the answer is, you know, yes, it's both. And so, I think it's fair to say that this obsessive compulsion that George Pullman had both drove his success and perhaps led to some of the demise of the company. You know, certainly in the strike, at the time of the strike, labor was very much looked down upon, you know, thought of as radicals. But rapidly in the aftermath, you know, Pullman was looked down upon by the Chicago business community as being completely unyielding. And so I just kind of use that as an example of, you know, what really was kind of an obsession with control. Yeah, both drove the company's greatness, and I think it's fair to say may have had an impact on its decline. I mean, as well as changing markets, right? The company in some rendition did last, over 100 years. But railroading changed, competition changed, and of course, corporate governance changed. Pullman was gone, pretty much by the turn of the century. That's when Robert Todd Lincoln took over after George's death. But
Yeah, well, of course, the passenger car market was drying up after World War II, but the freight car market went on strong, and as we've discussed, they
yeah,
built, tens of thousands, if not more, freight cars, some of which are still in service. So I don't know what the story is. Why did they go out of the freight car business?
Right.
They sold my understanding is they sold their designs to Trinity, and so some of the derivatives of some of their designs may still be being built today.
well, and there's an awful lot of legacy out there today on who owns different pieces of Pullman intellectual property. And so, yeah, on the freight car side, you're talking about Trinity, Alstom, via Bombardier, would have some of the intellectual property on the passenger car side. There's other almost like tentacles out there of firms that are in business today that have parts of the intellectual property.
All right, well, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation.
Thank you.